Hi guys, so welcome to part 2 of the renewable notes. We're going to go ahead and pick back up with hydroelectricity, which is going to be electricity generated from water. So let me get my pen here. So I just said it's electricity generated from water. Specifically, it's electricity generated by the kinetic energy of moving water. So we have to have some sort of movement that would be attached to a generator that would turn that potential energy into electricity. So it says this is the second most common form of renewable energy in the United States behind our biomass that we just talked about. The top 3 states in the U.S. that produce hydroelectricity would be Washington, followed by California, followed by Oregon. But if we're talking about worldwide producers of hydroelectricity, the number 1 country is going to be China, and they actually have the world's largest dam, which we'll mention on the next slide, followed by Brazil. Then finally we would come in third. This is what a typical dam looks like. We're going to talk more about this when we get to our water unit later in the year. But yeah, most forms of hydroelectricity utilize a dam where you back up some form of flowing water, usually a river, and you create a reservoir back behind it, and it's going to block up the water and create a whole bunch of potential energy which would push the water in through this intake area, and the water is going to be turning the turbine, which is hooked up to the generator, which generates electricity. And then, as you can see, we know the electricity makes its way out through the transmission lines and gets onto the grid. So you have your reservoir back behind the dam, and you have your outflow flowing water downstream of the dam. Okay, so how all of these different forms of hydroelectricity work, which I probably just described with that diagram. You have some form of moving water, which is going to contain that kinetic energy, which turn the turbine, which would then transform it into electricity when it's hooked up to the generator. Then it gets onto the grid via the transmission lines. It says the flow rate and or the vertical distance of the water falling, meaning how much potential energy do we have, is going to determine the amount of electricity produced. And we have a couple of different systems, not all of them involve dams. One system is called run-of-the-river system. It says water is held behind a dam and it runs through a channel before returning to the river. In this system, you're not really creating a big reservoir back behind the wall like we saw with your water impoundment, with your traditional dam forms of hydroelectricity. This one's kind of more free-flowing. From what I've read, it uses more vertical changes in the water, and the water's kind of constantly flowing, so it's kind of less disruptive to the ecosystem. Because when we get to our water unit, we talk about dams, we'll learn that dams can actually be pretty disruptive to the ecosystem. Yeah, so that's the run of the river. It's mostly just moving water, and you don't have the reservoir in the dam. But again, our traditional type of hydroelectricity, where you have the dam and you have the reservoir, we call that water impoundment. Water is stored in the reservoir behind the dam. We can control the flow of the water by opening and closing gates. Okay, so the gates can be open and closed in the dam, controls the flow of the water, which therefore can control the amount of electricity that we generate. So that's kind of nice. The world's largest dam is called the Three Gorges Dam in China. It's on the Yangtze River. There are a lot of pros and cons about this dam, and so again, I'll save a lot of that for our water unit because that'll be a really important part of our water unit. And then the last form of hydroelectric power is involving tides from the ocean, so we call these tidal systems. And it says here the movement of the water is actually driven by the gravitational pull of the moon. And there's pros and cons with this, but the main thing that I wanted to say here, I guess some of the major cons is that it's only going to be available in certain places and coastal areas where you have the tides moving in and out. And then also they say you've got a lot of development along the coast that come along with this form of energy. So, you know, people who live near coastlines aren't a big fan of it. They end up having to put transmission lines near the coast, which can be very disruptive to the ecosystems there, and it's aesthetically unattractive a lot of times too. So what are our major pros and cons with hydroelectricity? one of your major pros is that it can generate large amounts of electricity with little air pollution and carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. My fault. It's a non-depletable resource. We mentioned that at the very beginning of these notes that we'll always have water and we'll always have water flow, so it's non-depletable. Low cost to run. It can be a good thing for flood control, but again, later on in the year we'll also learn that sometimes building dams actually cause for floods to occur. And then when you create that dam and you have the reservoir back behind the wall, it actually creates a nice area for recreational purposes. Some cons with hydroelectricity: it can be a limited amount in any one area. You have high construction costs. You can have threats to the river ecosystems or the coastal ecosystems, depending on what type of electricity you're developing. It can cause issues with migration routes. Later on we'll talk about salmon, how they need to migrate upstream, and so we've had to build these little fish ladders for them to get through the dam. It can cause siltation, so buildup of a whole bunch of sediments back behind the dam. So that can be both bad behind the dam, but then it can also be bad downstream of the dam, because they're going to end up lacking a lot of those sediments that contain nutrients that organisms would need downstream as well. Again, disruption of habitat, loss of farmland if you have flooding, loss of cultural land. That's one of our issues with the Three Gorges Dam, is it's disrupted a lot of cultural areas. Displacement of people. It can cause environmental refugees, especially in cases of flooding. And then if you get a lot of flooded vegetation back behind the dam, the decaying of that vegetation can actually produce methane gas, which we know is a greenhouse gas. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and move on to solar energy. And just like water, we have various types of solar energy. Passive solar energy, we've talked a little bit about that before. We said you can do sustainable design of buildings, like place windows on the south-facing walls, put dark roofing on top to absorb more energy. But then also passive solar is also going to include things like solar ovens and box cookers. Quite a few people in developing countries use these. Let me actually go to this picture. This is what a solar cooker would look like. They say these are really helpful in like refugee camps where, if this woman was forced to go off-site looking for biomass, wood, and plants to burn to cook her food, she could possibly get harmed or killed. So they have created these very cheap solar cookers they leave on site, and they're able to cook meals right there, and they say they're very effective. So that's a form of passive solar. Active solar, again, we've got a couple different contraptions that do this. With this, it says we're capturing the energy of sunlight with the use of a pump or photovoltaic cell, which are your typical solar panels, and we actually generate electricity this way. In passive, we were not generating electricity. Active, now we're capturing energy from the sun to make electricity from it. And there's a couple different things that we can do. This one's kind of more passive. This is called a solar water heating system. It's a system that you can use in homes. You can use it for various purposes. You can use it to just create hot water. You can use it to heat swimming pools, or you can even use it as a means to heat your home. But what it does is it uses a non-freezing liquid that's circulated through a series of pumps and pipes, and it's going to move from a storage tank to a solar collector on the roof where the liquid is going to pick up heat, and then it brings that heat back to a tank, and again, that can be used to heat water, heat pools at your house, and even create heated air in a building as well. So let me show you real quick what that would look like. So here's your little collection tank where you would start with your cold water supply. The cold water, the cold liquid, is pumped to the ceiling where you have this contraption that's heating the water on the ceiling. Then the heated water gets returned back to the tank, which again could supply your home with hot water. Okay, and then what we typically think of when we think of solar power, we're thinking of these PV cells, which are otherwise known as your solar panels. Okay, and so the way that these things work is they capture energy from sun as light, not as heat, and it's converted directly into electricity. They use what we call semiconductors, which are those very thin, clear layers of material that we've seen before on stuff that's operated with solar power. They can use solar panels to supply direct electricity or to charge batteries for later use. If you're a home that's off the grid, meaning you are not attached to an electrical grid and you're operating all of your electricity in your house just on solar energy, you would have your solar panels and you would need to have lots of batteries to store up that electricity for, when it's nighttime, when you're dealing with days that aren't sunny, so you have that stored electricity. But I think that's a really cool concept to think about, that you could actually have a house off the grid and power everything you needed to in your home with just solar panels. That's pretty cool. It does say that most people who have solar panels on their house, they're actually still tied to the electrical grid. And then any leftover electricity that they don't use for their actual home would go back to the electric company, and the electric company would give them credits, basically pay them back for the electricity that they sent to the grid. We've got a lot of neat technologies out there. You guys have probably seen a lot of these off-the-grid uses of solar-powered panels. So our school zone lights, you've probably noticed that those have solar panels on top of them. They're totally off the grid. They're self-sustaining. They operate just from energy from the sun. They're making a lot of parking meters that are completely off the grid, completely solar paneled. The emergency phones on the sides of the highway, they say that those are all off the grid solar powered. So really, really neat stuff that you can do with solar panels. And I think I mentioned before, actually let me go to the next slide with the pictures. I mentioned before, and this is what a typical building would look like with solar panels on top of it. This is just a home, residential area. And again, this shows you what would happen as the solar energy comes down. It directly converts that incoming solar energy to electricity. And again, most of these homes are still attached to the grid, but some people are not attached to the grid. But anyways, what I was getting ready to say with these is sometimes you see people who are very environmentally conscious. They'll have a separate garage from their home, and they've got a big solar panel on top of their garage. And let's say they've got an electric plug-in car. They can get energy from their solar panel to power their electric car, and then thereby their electric car would be totally fossil fuel free. So that's another neat concept to kind of think your car is totally off the grid as well. Okay, another form of solar power is what we call concentrating solar thermal electricity. We just call these CST for short. And it says these are systems that are a large-scale example of using solar energy to generate electricity. And let me show you the picture of them real quick so that it makes sense while I'm describing it. So we're going to learn it's a system of a ton of mirrors that are all taking solar energy and reflecting it at this big, huge control tower in the middle. Okay, so what they do, just as I showed you, they use lenses or mirrors and tracking systems where they can actually follow the light. To focus the light falling on a large area into a small beam, it's the same idea as when you take a magnifying lens and you hold it on top of a piece of paper and you focus that sun on the paper so you can burn a hole through it. And by doing this, you focus all of the sun on this tower here in the middle, and you collect a large concentration of heat from the sun. It says the heat is then used to produce steam that turns a turbine that creates electricity. So the same process that we've been learning about all units so far. A little caveat to this is when you have these big, huge solar parks, I guess you could call them, they're going to require a large area. So it's best to be in a place like a large desert where it's clear skies, lots of sunshine all day long, wide open space. So these are pretty popular in California and in the Southwest in your desert areas. Okay, so that's what that would look like. Okay, so some pros and cons of active solar energy. You get no air pollution from solar energy at all. It's non-depletable. Again, we're not going to lose the sun. We're not going to run out of that energy. And a nice thing about solar is it says we can produce a lot of electricity during those hot summer days during peak demand, which we said is usually from June through September from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. This is a perfect time. You're going to be able to catch a lot of sun energy during this time. After your initial investment of solar energy, there's no cost to harvest the energy. However, a lot of times they are expensive to install initially. And so that's going to be one of our cons, and actually I'll say that first. You do have high initial costs to install these solar panels or to build any of these other active solar means of generating electricity. The manufacturing of the materials requires a high input of metals and water, so to make solar panels, it can be very environmentally destructive, both in the mining of these materials and in the processing that it takes to make them. So that's one of their biggest downfalls. And there's no plan for recycling the solar panels as of now. Again, it's geographically limited, as you can imagine. And again, it's not always sunny. And what if you live at really high latitudes that don't have periods of the year where they don't get a whole lot of sun? You would need to make sure you have backup storage, which would be in the form of a battery. So especially for those people who are totally off the grid, they'd have to have a large system of batteries to store any extra electricity. Okay, and then our next form of energy is going to be geothermal energy. Geothermal, it says you're using heat from naturally radioactive decay of elements deep within Earth, as well as heat coming from Earth. So, natural heat from Earth in one way or another. So here it just describes it as wherever magma comes close enough to the groundwater, that water becomes heated. Sometimes there's pressure behind it, and the pressure drives water upward into geysers, but when it stays underground, we can get to it by drilling, and we can use that to generate energy. Some of the largest geothermal producers worldwide are us, China, and Iceland, my favorite. Iceland is said to heat at least 87% of its homes with heat exchangers that collect heat by circling cool water underground to be heated and then return the heated water to the homes. And I'll show you what something like that looks like on the next slide. And these systems can actually be used worldwide, not necessarily the ones that are using geothermal heat, but ones that are using heat from the ground can be used really anywhere. Geothermal energy is used to generate electricity by producing steam, just like a power plant. And in the U.S., we have geothermal power plants in California, Nevada, Hawaii, and Utah, but again, they're geographically limited to where you have these existing areas of geologic activity. Okay, so this is interesting. This diagram right here is what we would call a ground source heat pump. This is called a ground source heat pump, and we'll see this on our pros and cons on the next slide. This is found under the umbrella of geothermal energy, but they say technically it's not really geothermal energy because what we're doing is we're using heat from the ground, but the heat from the ground we're using in these doesn't necessarily come from geothermal heat. It comes from the sun heating the ground and the ground staying warm. But because we're utilizing warmth from underground, we still lump it into the geothermal category. So just be aware of that. And this type of technology, they say you can use anywhere, all over the world. And the idea is during the winter, the ground is going to hold on to more heat than up above, than up in our house. And so the ground is going to stay warm, so we can actually pump this water, cool water, down underground. It can pick up heat from the ground and bring it back up, and we can use that to heat our homes. And they say you can do the opposite thing in the summer, again with the idea that underground is going to get much colder in the summer than it does above ground in our homes. So we could do the same idea there where we pump water down underground. It's going to get cool, and that brings it back up, and then we actually use that to cool down our homes. That's called a ground source heat pump. But as I said, that's not technically geothermal because it's heat from the sun that's heated up the ground. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. So yeah, a little bit different than what we just said here, where you have to have geologic activity and heated water and stuff close to underground, whereas this can be used anywhere. Okay, so pros and cons of any type of geothermal. The pros is that, again, it's non-depletable. You're always going to have this geologic activity underground or the warmth in the ground. And after the initial investment of setting up a system like this, there's not going to be any cost to harvest the energy. But again, like a lot of these things, it is probably expensive to set it up at the beginning. The diagram I just showed you on the last slide, those ground source heat pumps, we said they can be installed anywhere all over the world. I know that there's some in Virginia. I read about them. Some cons is that they can, if we're talking about the true geothermal energy, they can emit hazardous gases and steam because you do have that geologic activity there. And that type of energy is geographically limited, can only be used in certain places of the world. Okay, so next is wind. This is one of my favorite types of renewable energy. I think this is pretty cool. Wind, you're using those wind turbines, which you guys have probably seen before. I'll show you a picture of them on one of our upcoming slides. Again, just kind of like with the dam, we're converting that kinetic energy, energy of movement, into electrical energy. The countries with the largest wind energy generating capacity, meaning we produce lots of good, strong, high winds of at least 15 miles per hour. They say that's the recommended wind speed to get good wind energy from. Sorry about that. Look who the winner is in terms of wind energy generating capacity. It is us. However, we only obtain less than 1% of our electricity from wind. Behind us is Germany, Spain, China, India, Italy. So those are the countries with the top wind energy generating capacity. So even though we have the top wind energy generating capacity, we only get a small amount of our national electricity from wind power. Who is the winner? Denmark. They say Denmark supplies up to 21% of all of its electricity in its country coming from wind. So that's huge. A lot of Western Europe uses wind power as well. It's very, very popular to develop these offshore wind farms, especially in coastal countries. I actually took a trip to Denmark and Sweden and Norway a couple years ago, and we saw all sorts of offshore wind farms. We were on a boat. It was really cool. They're actually kind of, some people think they're ugly. I think that they were actually kind of cool looking. So anyways, yeah, Denmark, the Netherlands, UK, Sweden, they have a lot of these wind farms off the coast. We're looking to build a large one off of Cape Cod in Massachusetts in our country. And when I just recently took a trip to Germany and Austria, we saw wind farms all over the place, especially on farmland. And that's going to be one of our benefits of wind energy that we talk about here in a second, is you can use the land that you're using for wind farms for other purposes. So here's a picture of what a wind turbine looks like. You've got your blades here, so here comes the wind. And what's cool is they say you can actually change the direction that the blades are facing with this motorized drive thing. So if the wind's coming a different direction from day to day, you can rotate these blades so that they face the wind. So the blades are turned by the wind. That generates your kinetic energy. The gearbox is going to transfer that mechanical or kinetic energy to the generator, and then the generator converts that mechanical or kinetic energy into electricity. And then those are attached to transmission lines, and that would put it on the grid. Pros and cons of wind energy. Again, totally non-depletable. We'll always have the wind. After that expensive initial investment, there's no cost to harvest the energy after that. It says it's a low upfront cost, but again, I've seen plenty of sources that say it can be expensive, especially depending on the size of the turbine. Again, there's no air pollution. And as I mentioned earlier, shared land use. You can use the land that you're using for a wind farm. And again, if you've driven out into farm country, or you've been to other countries, you might have seen those big, huge wind turbines. A lot of times they use that as farmland. Some of the complaints with wind energy is that those turbines, especially if they're really big, they can make a noise. Environmentalists, especially people who are into birds and bird migration routes, they don't necessarily like these because they've been known to cause the death of birds and disrupt their migrations, and even bats. Again, these can be geographically limited to windy areas, and they would need to be windy areas where you can have transmission lines nearby. A lot of people think they're ugly or they're aesthetically displeasing, but I think they're actually kind of cool looking, especially on a wide open farmland with the cows grazing, and then you see these big turbines. I think they're kind of neat looking. Again, a similar issue as we talked with solar energy. If you're an off-the-grid system, you would need a large set of storage batteries to store away any electricity that you created. Okay, and then the very last type of energy that we're going to be talking about here is hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells. So, What is a hydrogen fuel cell? So a fuel cell, they describe it's a device that operates like a common battery where the electricity is generated by a reaction between a couple chemicals. But there's a difference between a fuel cell and a battery. In a battery, you would eventually use up the reactants and you can no longer use the battery. But in a fuel cell, reactants are constantly being added to the cell so it can run as long as fuel is supplied as an input. When we're using a hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen is our input. And the way that we get hydrogen is a little bit complicated. So here it says electricity can be generated by the reaction of hydrogen with oxygen to form water. So, and I'll show you a picture of this, I believe, on the next slide. Yeah, I'll show you how we do that on the next slide. But you input hydrogen, you input oxygen. Your only emissions you're going to get from this process, so if you had a car that ran off of a hydrogen fuel cell, the only emissions it would give off would be water. That's the product that it makes when the hydrogens and oxygens combine. And then, of course, you're getting energy to propel your car forward. It says the basic process forces protons from hydrogen gas through a membrane while electrons go a different direction. And when you separate the protons from the electrons, and these electrons are forced to go this different direction, that generates an electric current. So there's your electricity. And so, kind of a complicated process, but the picture tries to make it easier to understand. So showing how we would utilize a hydrogen fuel cell. You would input hydrogen and oxygen, and when you input hydrogen across this membrane, they say it splits the hydrogens apart, where the protons go through the membrane but the electrons do not. And so when the electrons go this different direction, that generates an electric current. And then eventually your hydrogens, the protons and the electrons from the hydrogens would meet up with the oxygens, and that would create water as your product. And so that's what this shows here in this explanation. And this shows what a hydrogen fuel cell car might look like in the future. One of the things that we would have is you would have to have really big hydrogen storage tanks, and so that's what we're going to talk about with our pros and cons. You'd have to have big storage tanks because they say hydrogen is a bulky gas. Then you have to have that with your battery here, and then you have this fuel cell stack as well. But it would be a totally electric car with an electric motor. The tricky part about hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells is how do we get hydrogen? They say getting hydrogen is difficult because having just free hydrogens, free H's out there in nature, it's pretty rare because hydrogen wants to form with other elements to make molecules pretty frequently. So methane is a common one, CO2, not CO2, water is a common molecule. So it's difficult to find singular H's, singular hydrogens on their own. So how can we get little hydrogens on their own? Well, they say one of the most common ways is to burn off natural gas, which is methane. But when you're doing that, you're inputting a lot of energy and you're getting your carbon dioxide, your CO2 waste product. So as I said, you're inputting a lot of energy to burn off natural gas, so it's very energy intensive. So down here it says a lot of these methods are going to seem counterintuitive because we're using a lot of energy, a lot of electricity to make more electricity. And so same thing with this electrolysis. Electrolysis is the process where we would apply an electric current to water to split water into singular hydrogens and oxygens. But again, very energy intensive, uses a lot of energy to do this. So as I just mentioned, it seems counterintuitive to use a lot of electricity to make more electricity, but if we can find a way to do this sustainably, meaning using solar power or wind power or something like that, to do these processes, once we get our little singular hydrogens, it can be used over and over again as an energy carrier. So it says it could be sustainable, especially if the initial energy that we would use to do this comes from a renewable source, but we're not to that point yet. Okay, so what are our major pros and cons for hydrogen fuel cells? Very efficient, zero pollution, and as I said, once we get the hydrogens made, we can use them over and over again. The cons: how do we get the hydrogen by itself? How do we produce regular old hydrogen? We either have to do combustion of natural gas or do the electrolysis, which both require a lot of energy input, so it's a very energy intensive process. Another major concern, there's a lack of a distribution network. So like if we have a whole bunch of these hydrogen fuel cell cars in the future, we would need a system to distribute hydrogen gas, which means we would need trucks to truck around the hydrogen. We would need stations, just like we have gas stations. We would need a distribution network. We don't have that now, and that kind of goes along with this. How do we store hydrogen and how do we transport it? As I mentioned earlier, it's a very bulky gas, so it would require a really, really large tank in the car. They say almost like too large, to how we can kind of figure that out at this point. It's also a very explosive gas, so you run the risk of having bad explosions in an accident or something like that in your car. So there's a lot that still needs to be worked out with hydrogen fuel cell cars. There are some people who say it's the future of energy, in this country and in the world, but there are others that say it's going to be a long time before we figure hydrogen out. But still, it has a promising future. The very last slide that I have is going to list all of our different forms of renewable energy that we've talked about in these notes and your advantages and disadvantages. Obviously you can't see this very well, so I plan to print out a handout for you guys so you have those. So that's going to be it for our renewable energy, and I'm hoping to post a notes quiz for you guys to take at the conclusion of these.